Hey there. Today, I'm going to tell you about how an ordinary evening turned into something completely unexpected. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the house. I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, with the soft hum of the radio playing in the background. My stepson, Jake, had just come home from college for the weekend. I had adopted him when he was little, and our relationship had always been like that of a real mother and son. Jake had grown up, now 21 years old, tall, confident, and full of life. The atmosphere in our home had always been peaceful and comfortable, but lately he seemed different. More mature, more introspective. Dinner was ready, so I called him over from the living room. As we sat down to eat, I noticed he was quieter than usual. At first, I brushed it off as exhaustion from school. We talked about his classes, his friends, and how much he missed being home. But there was something in his eyes, a certain depth, as if he was carrying emotions he wasn't sharing. After dinner, we decided to watch a movie together. The living room was cozy, lit by a warm, dim glow. As the film played, Jake seemed unusually reflective. I tried to shake off my thoughts, convincing myself it was just my imagination. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. I looked at him and smiled. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just a little tired," I replied, hoping to ease his concern. He nodded, but something about his expression lingered in my mind. The next morning, I woke up still thinking about the previous night. Maybe I was just overanalyzing things. When I walked into the kitchen, Jake was already there, sipping coffee with a smile. "I was thinking about going for a walk today. Want to join me?" he asked casually. I hesitated for a moment, but then I reminded myself, it was just a walk, nothing more. We walked along a familiar trail, reminiscing about old memories and talking about his plans for the future. But every so often the conversation would slow, and I could sense something weighing on his mind. When we reached a scenic overlook, he suddenly stopped and turned to me. "Mom, you've always been there for me," he said, his voice both soft and serious. "I don't know what I'd do without you." I smiled at him warmly. "That's what family is for, Jake. We always support each other." He nodded, looking away for a moment before speaking again. "I guess I've just been thinking a lot lately, about life, about how things change." I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "That's completely normal, Jake. Growing up comes with a lot of emotions and realizations. Just remember, you're never alone." He exhaled and smiled. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that." As we made our way back home, I felt a sense of relief. Sometimes all we need is an honest conversation to clear the air. Jake grabbed my hand and something inside me shook. My heart was racing. I looked into his eyes, but there was something there I didn't want to see. Something deep, intense, and impossible to define. "Let go of my hand, Jake," I said, my voice trembling slightly. He hesitated for a moment. "Mom," he whispered, his voice uncertain. "I don't know what's happening. I can't ignore how I feel." A wave of unease surged through me. This had to stop. No matter how difficult it was, I had to set things straight. "Jake, we need to take a step back," I said firmly. He looked at me for a few seconds, then slowly pulled his hand away. His expression was conflicted, and I could see the turmoil in his eyes. Taking a deep breath, I steadied myself. "Come on, let's go back inside," I said. The walk home was silent. The air between us felt heavier than before, filled with words neither of us could say. When we got home, I went straight to my room, closing the door behind me. I leaned against it, exhaling deeply. This couldn't continue. I barely slept that night. My mind kept replaying everything. Why was Jake feeling this way? How could I make sure we kept our relationship healthy and normal? The next morning, I walked into the kitchen to find Jake sitting at the table with his coffee. He seemed normal, but his eyes carried a weight I hadn't seen before. After a moment, he looked down. "I'm sorry about last night," he said softly. I took a sip of my coffee and sighed. "It's okay, Jake. Just, let's move on, all right?" He nodded slowly, but I could tell this wasn't something he could easily forget. That day, we kept our distance. That evening, as I sat alone in my room, I knew what needed to happen. Jake needed to return to school earlier than planned. We both needed space. At dinner, I brought it up. "Jake, I said carefully. I think it's best if you head back to school a little early. We both need time to clear our heads. He looked surprised for a moment, then his face became unreadable. I understand, he said simply. The next morning, as he packed his things, I watched him, my heart heavy. My son, my little Jake, who wasn't so little anymore. The tension between us had changed everything. When he reached the front door, he turned back to me. "Will you forgive me?" he asked quietly. My heart ached. There's nothing to forgive, Jake. We just need to find our way back to normal. He nodded, then stepped outside. As the door closed behind him, I let out a deep breath. A mixture of relief and sadness filled me. He was gone. But could things ever go back to the way they were? Only time would tell. This was my story. What would you have done? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to Infidelity Stories for more stories.